Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome back to our study of In Search of the Miraculous. We've arrived at chapter 12, two-thirds of the way through now, and things begin to get really interesting in sort of, as well as the ideas get expounded more and more deeply, Ouspensky's own personal journey begins to unfold, and especially the last few chapters we really see the impact that Gurdjieff's fourth way and the ideas and the impact they've had on Ouspensky's life. So as always, I'll just go through the contents with you briefly, and then we'll get right into the story. And even the chapter, reading so many stories here at Book Club, I'm thinking it's a story. Oh, hello there, Kathy, Tyler, and Julie. I'm glad you guys could make it and are interested in Search of the Miraculous. So this is the contents of what we will be reading. And no storybook. This is what we will cover in chapter 12. Working groups becomes more intensive. Each man's limited repertoire of roles, the choice between work on oneself and a quiet life, which is a very powerful part of the chapter. Difficulties of obedience, the place of tasks. G gives a definite task, reaction of friends to the ideas. The system brings out the best or the worst in people. What people can come to the work. Preparation, disappointment is necessary. Question with which a man aches. Re-evaluation of friends. Talk about types. G gives a further task. Attempts to relate the story of one's life. Intonations, essence and personality. Another interesting theme that carries through all of the whole work. Sincerity, a bad mood. G promises to answer any question. Eternal recurrence, an experiment on separating personality from essence. A talk about sex, the role of sex as the principal motive force of all mechanicalness, another deep topic. Sex as the chief possibility of liberation. New birth, transmutation of sex energy, abuses of sex, is abstinence useful, right work of centers, and a permanent center of gravity. And I like this very much, how in this book and all of Ouspensky's books, in fact, each chapter has the table of contents before, so you know what you can expect. And if you're ever looking through, you can, sort of, well, I suppose if you know the book or are familiar with the book enough, you know what's going on throughout and where to find things. But that's that. And because I'm reading from my screen here, as you'll see, I won't be able to access the chat very much. I'll check in every now and again, maybe when we have a paragraph break, I'll look in. But any questions, get them in the chat, and I'll read through it at the end. And also any questions about the whole of In Search of the Miraculous, if you're working your way through it from chapter 1 onwards, I'll read all the comments. So if you've got any questions or queries or want me to speak more about a particular aspect of In Search of the Miraculous, then get those comments just in each video, because like I said, I get all the comments and I'm very happy to speak more on whatever you'd like to know more about or just hear me speak more about. And hello there, Zanya, welcome, and Ali. It's great to see you all. I wasn't expecting anyone this evening, so it's lovely to have you here joining for this, fantastic book and another brilliant chapter. So let's get right into it. Like I say, any questions or comments I'll address at the end. But for now, chapter 12 of In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky. By that time, midsummer 1916, work in our groups began to take new and more intensive forms. G spent most of the time in St. Petersburg, only going to Moscow for a few days and coming back again, generally with 2 or 3 of his Moscow pupils. Our lectures and meetings had by that time already lost their formal character. We had all begun to know one another better, and, though there was a little friction, we represented on the whole a very compact group, united by interest in the new ideas we were learning and the new possibilities of knowledge and self-knowledge which had been opened out before us. At that time there were about 30 of us. We met almost every evening. Several times on arriving from Moscow, G arranged excursions into the country for large parties, and picnics were where we had shashlik, which were somehow totally out of keeping with St. Petersburg. There remains in my memory a trip to Ostrovsky up the river Neva, more particularly because I suddenly realized on this trip why G arranged these seemingly quite aimless amusements. I realized that he was all the time observing, and that many of us on these occasions showed entirely new aspects of ourselves which had remained well hidden at the formal meetings in St. Petersburg. My meetings with G's Moscow pupils were at the time quite unlike my first meeting with them in the spring of the preceding year. They did not appear to me now to be either artificial or to be playing a role which had been learned by heart. On the contrary, I always eagerly awaited their coming and tried to find out from them what their work consisted of in Moscow and what G had said to them that we did not know. And just a brief comment, early in the work or early in the book, Ouspensky first meets the Moscow pupils, and like he says there, he felt that they were very sort of wooden and artificial. And so, yeah, he's just referring to that. And I found out from them a great deal which came in very useful to me later in my work. In my new talks with them, I saw the development of a very definite plan. We were not only learning from G, but we had also to learn from one another. I was beginning to see G's groups as a school of some medieval painter whose pupils lived with him and worked with him and, while learning from him, taught one another. At the same time, I understood why G's Moscow pupils could not answer my questions at our first meeting. I realized how utterly naive my questions had been. On what is based their work on themselves? What constitutes the system which they study? What is the origin of this system? And so on. I understood now that these questions could not be answered. One must learn in order to begin to understand this. And at that time, a little over a year ago, I had thought I had the right to ask such questions, just as the new people who now came to us began with precisely the same kind of questions, and were surprised we did not answer them, and, as we were already able to see, regarded us as artificial or as playing a part which we had learned. But new people appeared only at large meetings at which G took part. Meetings of the original group were at that time held separately, and it was quite clear why this should have been so. We were already beginning to get free from the self-confidence and the knowing of everything with which people approached the work, and we could already understand G better than before. But at general meetings it was extraordinarily interesting for us to hear how new people asked the same questions we used to ask in the beginning, and how they did not understand the same elementary simple things that we had been unable to understand. These meetings with new people gave us a certain amount of self-satisfaction. But when we were alone again with G, he often, with one word, destroyed everything that we had built up for ourselves, and forced us to see that actually we did not as yet know anything or understand anything, either in ourselves or in others. The whole trouble is that you are quite sure that you are always one and the same, he said. But I see you quite differently. For instance, I see that today one Ouspensky has come here, whereas yesterday there was another. Or the doctor. Before you came, we were sitting and talking here together. He was one person. Then you all came. I happened to glance at him, and I see quite another doctor sitting there. And the one I see when I am alone with him, you very seldom see. You must realize that each man has a definite repertoire of roles which he plays in ordinary circumstances, said G. In this connection, he has a role for every kind of circumstance in which he ordinarily finds himself in life, but put him into even only slightly different circumstances, and he is unable to find a suitable role, and for a short time he becomes himself. The study of the roles a man plays represent a very necessary part of self-knowledge. Each man's repertoire is very limited, and if a man simply says I and Ivan Ivanitch, maybe, he will not see the whole of himself, because Ivan Ivanitch also is not one. A man has at least 5 or 6 of them. 1 or 2 for his family, 1 or 2 at his office, 1 for his subordinates and another for his superiors, 1 for friends in a restaurant, and perhaps 1 who is interested in exalted ideas and likes intellectual conversation, and at different times the man is fully identified with one of them and is unable to separate himself from it. To see the roles, to know one's repertoire, particularly to know its limitedness, is to know a great deal. But the point is that outside his repertoire, a man feels very uncomfortable, should something push him, if only temporarily, out of his rut, and he tries his hardest to return to any one of his usual roles. Directly he falls back into the rut, everything at once goes smoothly again, and the feeling of awkwardness and tension disappears. This is how it is in life. But in the work, in order to observe oneself, one must become reconciled to this awkwardness and tension and to the feeling of discomfort and helplessness. Only by experiencing this discomfort can a man really observe himself, and it is clear why this is so. When a man is not playing any of his usual roles, when he cannot find a suitable role in his repertoire, he feels that he is undressed. He is cold and ashamed and wants to run away from everybody. But the question arises, what does he want? A quiet life or to work on himself? If he wants a quiet life, he must certainly, first of all, never move out of his repertoire. In his usual roles, he feels comfortable and at peace. But if he wants to work on himself, he must destroy his peace. To have them both together is in no way possible. A man must make a choice. But when choosing, the result is very often deceit. That is to say, a man tries to deceive himself. In words, he chooses work, but in reality, he does not want to lose his peace. The result is that he sits between 2 stools. Between 2 stools. This is the most uncomfortable position of all. He does no work at all, and he gets no comfort whatever. But it is very difficult for a man to decide to throw everything to the devil and begin real work. And why is it difficult? Principally because his life is too easy, and even if he considers it bad, he is already accustomed to it. It is better for it to be bad yet known. But here there is something new and unknown. He does not even know whether any result can be got from it or not. And besides, the most difficult thing here is that it is necessary to obey someone, to submit to someone. If a man could invent difficulties and sacrifices for himself, he would sometimes go very far. But the point here is that this is not possible. It is necessary to obey another or to follow the direction of general work, the control of which can belong only to one person. Such submission is the most difficult thing that there can be for a man who thinks that he is capable of deciding anything or of doing anything. Of course, when he gets rid of these fantasies and sees what he really is, the difficulty disappears. This, however, can only take place in the course of work, but to begin to work, and particularly to continue to work, is very difficult. And it is difficult because life runs too smoothly. And so I'll just have a look at the chat. Hello there, Bookworms Book Club. And no questions as of yet. But just briefly, in our little Discord Gurdjieff group, we've recently been discussing some of these things, particularly when you go outside of your normal roles, out of the rut, as Gurdjieff says. You're sort of forced into awakening because there's no particular role that you're used to acting out, if you like, according to what Gurdjieff said there. There's no mechanical role that you can fall into, and so you'll instantly wake up. But if you're not working and you're not seeking out these difficult circumstances, the goal will be to sort of try and get back into the rut as soon as possible to, like Gurdjieff says at the end there, for life to run smoothly again. And another thing, Gurdjieff, and I think Maurice Nicole has an essay about it, and also Ouspensky writes more about it, this concept of sitting between 2 stools. And it can happen very often early in one's work, where you first encounter the work. I myself experienced this and sort of, this sitting between 2 stools, like they've just said there. So you're not you're not working, but you're not living in life smoothly. Chevals, yes, I will do. Yeah, let me do it here quickly. Bear with me, guys. I'm just going to put the Discord group in for Chevals. But if you're not seeking awakening and higher states of consciousness fully, and you're not completely asleep in life and just automatically going through the motions, then Gurdjieff would say you sit between two stools. And according to that passage that we've just read there, this can be amongst the most difficult position, because sort of you're neither doing one thing or the other. So I'm just going to grab this this link. I should have done it at the end, actually. I was just saying, wasn't I, that I'll address all these things at the end, but maybe I'm asleep. There you go. Let's get back to the chapter. On one occasion, continuing this talk about the work of groups, G said, "Later on you will see that everyone in the work is given his own individual tasks corresponding to his type and his chief feature, or his chief fault, that is, something that will give him an opportunity of struggling more intensively against his chief fault. But besides individual tasks, there are general tasks which are given to the group as a whole, in which case the whole group is responsible for their execution or their non-execution, although in some cases the group is also responsible for individual tasks." So this will be anyone in the Gurdjieff Discord group. This will be an interesting thing for us to consider and keep in mind, this general task. But first we will take general tasks. For instance, you ought by now to have some understanding as to the nature of the system and its principal methods, and you ought to be able to pass these ideas on to others. You will remember that at the beginning I was against your talking about the ideas of the system outside the groups. On the contrary, there was a definite rule that none of you, excepting those whom I specially instructed to do so, should talk to anyone, either about the groups or the lectures or the ideas. And I explained then why this was necessary. You would not have been able to give a correct picture, a correct impression. Instead of giving people the possibility of coming to these ideas, you would have repelled them forever. You would have even deprived them of the possibility of coming to them at any later time. But now the situation is different. You have already heard enough, and if you really have made efforts to understand what you have heard, then you should be able to pass it on to others. Therefore, I give you all a definite task. Try to lead conversations with your friends and acquaintances up to these subjects. Try to prepare those who show interest and, if they ask you to, bring them to the meetings. But everyone must realize that this is his own task, and not expect others to do it for him. The proper performance of this task by each of you will show first that you have already assimilated something, understood something, and second, that you are able to appraise people, to understand with whom it is worthwhile talking and with whom it is not worthwhile, because the majority of people cannot take in any of these ideas, and it is perfectly useless to talk to them. But at the same time, there are people who are able to take in these ideas and with whom it is worthwhile talking. And so yeah, I'm not sure that's a task I'd recommend at the moment. Maybe later on, but it's yeah, it can be very painful. Yeah, and I feel you have to talk to many people. It's my experience and my opinion that you have to speak with many people to find one interested party, but that's a special moment if you can introduce someone to this work. It's yeah, it can be very special if they find it and become interested in it. But let's continue. The next meeting after this was very interesting. Everyone was full of impressions of talks with friends. Everyone had a great many questions. Everyone was somewhat discouraged and disappointed, as I was just saying. It proved that friends and acquaintances asked very shrewd questions to most of our people, to which most of our people had no answers. They asked, for instance, what we had got from the work, and openly expressed doubts as to our remembering ourselves. On the other hand, others had themselves no doubt whatever that they remembered themselves. Others found the ray of creation and the seven cosmoses ridiculous and useless. What has geography to do with this? Very wittily asked one of my friends, parodying a sentence from an amusing play which had been running shortly before this. Others asked who had seen the centres and how they could be seen. Others found absurd the idea that we could not do. Others found the idea of esotericism entertaining but not convincing. Others said that this idea in general was a new invention. Others were not prepared to sacrifice their descent from apes. Others found that there was no idea of the love of mankind in the system. Others said that our ideas were thoroughgoing materialism, that we wanted to make people machines, that there was no idea of the miraculous, no idealism, and so on and so on. And that little paragraph there is a good one because it summarizes, if you ever were to take the general task of speaking to people, friends and acquaintances about the ideas, that's a pretty good paragraph there to take with you, and try and lead up to these subjects. G laughed when we recounted to him our conversations with our friends. This is nothing, he said. If you were to put together everything that people are able to say about this system, you would not believe in it yourselves. This system has a wonderful property. Even a mere contact with it calls forth either the best or the worst in people. You may know a man all your life and think that he is not a bad fellow, that he is even rather intelligent. Try speaking to him about these ideas, and you will see at once that he is an utter fool. Another man, on the other hand, might appear to have nothing in him, but speak to him on these subjects, and you find that he thinks, and thinks very seriously. How can we recognize people who are able to come to the work? Asked one of those present. How to recognize them is another question, said G. To do this, it is necessary, to a certain extent, to be. But before speaking of this, we must establish what kind of people are able to come to the work, and what kind are not able. You must understand that a man should have first a certain preparation, certain luggage, or maybe that language, that should be luggage or language. Language would be more appropriate, I reckon. A certain language. He should know what it is possible to know through ordinary channels about the ideas of esotericism, about hidden knowledge, about possibilities of the inner evolution of man, and so on. What I mean is that these ideas ought not to appear to him as something entirely new. Otherwise it is difficult to speak to him. It is useful also if he has at least some scientific or philosophical preparation. If a man has a good knowledge of religion, this can also be useful. But if he is tied to religious forms and has no understanding of their essence, he will find it very difficult. In general, if a man knows but little, has read but little, has thought but little, it is difficult to talk to him. If he has a good essence, there is another way for him without any talks at all. But in this case, he has to be obedient. He has to give up his will. And he has to come to this also in some way or other. It can be said that there is one general rule for everybody. In order to approach this system seriously, people must be disappointed. First of all in themselves, that is to say, in their powers, and secondly in all the old ways. A man cannot feel what is most valuable in the system unless he is disappointed in what he has been doing, disappointed in what he has been searching for. If he is a scientist, he should be disappointed in his science. If he is a religious man, he should be disappointed in his religion. If he is a politician, he should be disappointed in politics. If he is a philosopher, he should be disappointed in philosophy. If he is a theosophist, he should be disappointed in theosophy. If he is an occultist, he should be disappointed in occultism, and so on. But you must understand what this means. I say, for instance, that a religious man should be disappointed in religion. This does not mean that he should lose his faith. On the contrary, it means being disappointed in the teaching and the methods only. realizing that the religious teaching he knows is not enough for him, can lead him nowhere. All religious teachings, excepting, of course, the completely degenerate religions of savages and the invented religions and sects of modern times, consist of two parts, the visible and the hidden. To be disappointed in religion means being disappointed in the visible, and to feel the necessity for finding the hidden and unknown part of religion. To be disappointed in science does not mean losing interest in knowledge. It means being convinced that the usual scientific methods are not only useless but lead to the construction of absurd and self-contradictory theories, and having become convinced of this, to begin to search for others. To be disappointed in philosophy means being convinced that ordinary philosophy is merely, as it is said in the Russian proverb, pouring from one empty vessel into another, and that people do not even know what philosophy means, although true philosophy also can and should exist. To be disappointed in occultism does not mean losing faith in the miraculous. It is merely being convinced that ordinary, accessible, and even advertised occultism, under whatever name it may pass, is simply charlatanism and self-deception, and that, although somewhere something does exist, everything that man knows or is able to learn in the ordinary way is not what he needs. So that, no matter what he used to do before, no matter what used to interest him, if a man has arrived at this state of disappointment in ways that are possible and accessible, it is worthwhile speaking to him about our system, and then he may come to the work. But if he continues to think that he is able to find anything on his former way, or that he has not as yet tried all the ways, or that he can by himself find anything or do anything, it means that he is not ready. I do not mean that he must throw up everything he used to do before. This is entirely unnecessary. On the contrary, it is often even better if he continues to do what he used to do, but he must realize that it is only a profession, or a habit, or a necessity. In this case, it is another matter. He will then be able not to identify. There is only one thing incompatible with work, and that is professional occultism. In other words, professional charlatanism. All these spiritualists, healers, clairvoyants, and so on, or even people closely connected with them, are none of them any good to us. And you must always remember this and take care not to tell them much, because everything they learn from you they might use for their own purposes, that is, to make fools of other people. There are still other categories which are no good, but we will speak of them later. In the meantime, remember one thing only. A man must be sufficiently disappointed in ordinary ways, and he must at the same time think or be able to accept the idea that there may be something, somewhere. If you should speak to such a man, he might discern the flavor of truth in what you say, no matter how clumsily you might speak. But if you should speak to a man who is convinced about something else, everything you say will sound absurd to him, and he will never even listen to you seriously. It is not worthwhile wasting time on him. This system is for those who have already sought and have burned themselves. Those who have not sought and who are not seeking do not need it. And those who have not yet burned themselves do not need it either. But this is not what people begin with, said one of our company. They ask, do we admit the existence of the ether? Or how do we look on evolution? Or why do we not believe in progress? Or why do we not think that people can and should organize life on the basis of justice and the common good, and things of that sort? All questions are good, said G, and you can begin from any question, if only it is sincere. You understand that what I mean is that this very question about ether, or about progress, or about the common good could be asked by a man simply in order to say something, or to repeat what someone else has said, or what he has read in some book. And, on the other hand, he could ask it because this is the question with which he aches. If it is an aching question for him, you can give him an answer, and you can bring him to the system through any question whatever. But it is necessary for the question to be an aching one. And this was one thing that stayed with me, just a brief comment on there about being dissatisfied with life. And I can remember somewhere else in the Gurdjieff canon and literature that there's like a caveat to that, where Gurdjieff saying to be interested in the work, or to sort of be at the right stage in life to find the work, you either, like he's just said there, you either have to be dissatisfied in your religion, your science, your philosophy or whatever it is, you know, your general life, your relationships, the system, whatever, or you have to be acutely aware of there being something more, something higher than what this life has to offer. You know, there must be something more, something deeper. And if you have these two things, if you're at once dissatisfied and yearning for something more out of life, then that's when, if you arrive at the work or are lucky enough to discover the work at those points in your life, then you can really come to it and take it on board with seriousness. Our talks about people who could be interested in the system and able to work involuntarily led us towards a valuation of our friends from an entirely new point of view. In this respect, we all experienced bitter disappointment. Even before G had formally requested us to speak of the system to our friends, we had of course all tried in one way or another to talk about it at any rate with those of them whom we met most often. And in most cases our enthusiasm in regards to the ideas of the system met with a very cold reception. They did not understand us. The ideas which seemed to us new and original seemed to our friends to be old and tedious, leading nowhere and even repellent. This astonished us more than anything else. We were amazed that people with whom we had felt an inner intimacy, with whom in former times we had been able to talk about all questions that worried us, and in whom we found a response, could fail to see what we saw, and above all, that they could see something quite opposite. I have to say that, in regard to my own personal experience, it gave me a very strange and even painful impression. I speak of the absolute impossibility of making people understand us. We are, of course, accustomed to this in ordinary life, in the realm of ordinary questions, and we know that people who are hostile to us at heart, or narrow-minded, or incapable of thought, can misunderstand us, twist and distort anything we say, can ascribe to us thoughts we never had, words which we never uttered, and so on. But now, when we saw that all this was being done by those whom we used to regard as our kind of people, with whom we used to spend very much of our time, and who formerly had seemed to us to understand us better than anyone else, it produced on us a discouraging impression. Such cases, of course, constituted the exceptions. Most of our friends were merely indifferent, and all our attempts to infect them with our interest in G's system led to nothing. But sometimes they got a very curious impression of us. I do not remember now who was the first to notice that our friends found we had begun to change for the worst. They found us less interesting than we had been before. They told us we were becoming colourless, as though we were fading, were losing our former spontaneity, our former responsiveness to everything, that we were becoming machines, were ceasing to think originally, were ceasing to feel, that we were merely repeating like parrots what we had heard from G. G laughed a great deal when we told him about this. "Wait, there is worse to come," he said. "Do you understand what this really means? It means that you have stopped lying. At any rate, you don't lie so well, that is, you can no longer lie in so interesting a way as before. He is an interesting man who lies well, but you are already ashamed of lying. You are now able to acknowledge to yourselves sometimes that there is something you do not know or do not understand, and you cannot talk as if you knew all about everything. It means, of course, that you have become less interesting, less original, and less, as they say, responsive. So now you are really able to see what sort of people your friends are, and on their part they are sorry for you, and in their own way they are right. You have already begun to die." He emphasized this word. "It is a long way yet to complete death, but still a certain amount of silliness is going out of you. You can no longer deceive yourselves as sincerely as you did before. You have now got the taste of truth. Why does it seem to me sometimes now that I understand absolutely nothing?" said one of those present. "Formerly I used to think that sometimes, at any rate, there were some things I understood, but now I do not understand anything." "It means you have begun to understand," said G. "When you understood nothing, you thought you understood everything, or at any rate that you are able to understand everything. Now when you have begun to understand, you think you do not understand. This comes about because the taste of understanding was quite unknown to you before, and now the taste of understanding seems to you to be a lack of understanding. In our talks, we often return to the impressions of our friends had of us, and to our new impressions of our friends. And we began to realize that, more than anything else, these ideas could either unite people or separate them. And just a quick comment about two things really. That bit there about understanding and knowing. If you're interested in that side of things, knowledge and sort of understanding and knowing that you know, in Plato's Alcibiades dialogue, it's wonderful because Plato through Socrates talks about ignorance and double ignorance. So again, a lot of people that are being discussed here, I'm assuming that they're doubly ignorant. So they don't know, and they don't even know that they don't know. And so this is why Socrates has such a profound effect on his readers, because he knows he doesn't know and he wants to investigate with the person in the dialogue. He's probing them with questions. And also my own, I won't go into too much detail, but my own experience with my friends and my work colleagues also, when I encountered the work first of all. And to begin with, I was a sort of radical. I was very radical. It's my sort of, my character, if you like. I dive into something wholeheartedly, and I was involved in the work for many years. I still am, I suppose, sharing these readings with you guys. But I remember distinctly one of my friends, he would say it regular. He would say to me, "Where's the old Lewis? Where's the old Lewis? I want the old Lewis back." Because of what Gurdjieff's describing there. I'd lost the silliness. I'd stopped talking unnecessarily. I wasn't so wrapped up in my own ego and personality and the big man Lewis, the clever man Lewis, the funny man Lewis. And I would just be very quiet, and boring, they would say. Boring. You've changed. Where's the old Lewis? And it's these things happen, right? But if we want to follow the work and become man number 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, then you may need to lose some friends or appear boring for a little while. There was once a very long and interesting talk about types. G repeated everything he had said before about this, together with many additions and indications for personal work. Each of you, he said, has probably met in life people of one and the same type. Such people often even look like one another, and their inner reaction to things are exactly the same. What one likes, the other will like. What one does not like, the other will not like. You must remember such occasions because you can study the science of types only by meeting types. There is no other method. Everything else is imagination. You must understand that in the conditions in which you live, you cannot meet with more than 6 or 7 types, although there are in life a greater number of fundamental types. The rest are all combinations of these fundamental types. How many fundamental types are there in all? Asked someone. Some people say 12, said G. According to the legend, the 12 apostles represented the 12 types. Others say more. He paused. May we know these 12 types, that is, their definitions and characteristics? Asked one of those present. I was expecting this question, said G. There has never been an occasion when I have spoken of types when some clever person has not asked this question. How is it you do not understand that if it could be explained, it would have been explained long ago? But the whole thing is that types and their differences cannot be defined in ordinary language, and the language in which they could be defined you do not as yet know, and will not know for a long time. It is exactly the same as with the 48 laws. Someone invariably asks whether he may not know these 48 laws, as if it were possible. Understand that you are being given everything that can be given. With the help of what is given to you, you must find the rest. But I know that I am wasting my time now in saying this. You still do not understand me, and will not understand for a long time yet. Think of the difference between knowledge and being. These are things for the understanding of which a different being is necessary. But if there are no more than 7 types around us, why can we not know them? That is, know what is the chief difference between them, and, when meeting them, be able to recognize and distinguish them, said one of us. You must begin with yourself, and with the observation of which I have already spoken, said G. Otherwise it would be knowledge of which you would be able to make no use. Some of you think you can see types, but they are not types at all that you see. In order to see types, one must know one's own type and be able to depart from it. In order to know one's own type, one must make a good study of one's life, one's whole life from the very beginning. One must know why and how things have happened. I want to give you all a task. It will be a general and an individual task at one and the same time. Let every one of you in the group tell about his life. Everything must be told in detail, without embellishment and without suppressing anything. Emphasize the principal and essential things without dwelling on trifles and details. You must be sincere and not be afraid that others will take anything in a wrong way, because everyone is in the same position. Everyone must strip himself. Everyone must show himself as he is. This task will once more show you why nothing must be taken outside the group. Nobody would dare to speak if he thought or suspected that what he said in the group would be repeated outside. But he ought to be fully and firmly convinced that nothing will be repeated, and then he will be able to speak without fear, with the understanding that others must do the same. Soon afterwards, G went to Moscow, and in his absence we tried in various ways to carry out the tasks allotted to us. First of all, in order to put G's tasks more easily into practice, some of us, at my suggestion, tried telling the story of our lives, not at the general group meeting, but in small groups composed of people they knew best. I am bound to say that all these attempts came to nothing. Some said too much. Others said too little. Some went into unnecessary details or into descriptions of what they considered were their particular and original characteristics. Others concentrated on their sins and errors. But everything taken together failed to produce what G evidently expected. The result was anecdotes or chronological memoirs which interested nobody, and family recollections which made people yawn. Something was wrong. But what exactly was wrong, even those who had tried to be as sincere as they could were unable to determine. I remember my own attempts. In the first place, I tried to convey certain early childhood impressions which seemed to me psychologically interesting, because I remembered myself as I was at a very early age and was always myself astonished by some of these early impressions. But nobody was interested in this, and I quickly saw that this was certainly not what was required of us. I proceeded further, but almost immediately I felt a certainty that there were many things that I had no intention whatever of telling. This was a quite unexpected realization. I had accepted G's idea without any opposition, and I thought I would be able to tell the story of my life without any particular difficulty. But in reality it turned out to be quite impossible. Something in me registered such a vehement protest against it that I did not even attempt to struggle, and in speaking of certain periods of my life, I tried to give only the general idea and the significance of the facts which I did not want to relate. In this connection I noted that my voice and intonations changed when I talked in this way. This helped me to understand other people. I began to hear that, in speaking of themselves and their lives, they also spoke in different voices and different intonations. And there were intonations of a particular kind which I had first heard in myself, and which showed me that people wanted to hide something in what they were talking about. But intonations gave them away. Observation of intonations afterwards made it possible for me to understand many other things. And Gurdjieff would say that we have to study man and the universe, ourselves and others. And that some things are easier to see in ourselves, other things are easier to see in the universe or in the world. And like what Ouspensky's just said there, he could see in himself when he was uncomfortable and wasn't willing to share certain aspects of his life, his intonation would change. And so once he realized and observed that in himself, it was much easier for him to observe it in other people in the groups, and then other people in life. So that's another sort of powerful lesson, that it might be a painful thing that we realize in our life, but it can help us with our ongoing studies. When G next came to Petersburg, he had been in Moscow this time for 2 or 3 weeks, we told him of our attempts. He listened to everything and merely said that we did not know how to separate personality from essence. Personality hides behind essence, he said, and essence hides behind personality, and they mutually screen each other. How can essence be separated from personality? Asked one of those present. And I think this is an interesting part of the book coming up, where Gurdjieff shuts off one of these things. I think. I hope I'm right, but let's keep going. How do you separate your own from what is not your own? G replied. It is necessary to think. It is necessary to know where one or another of your characteristics has come from. And it is necessary to realize that most people, especially in your circle of society, have very little of their own. Everything they have is not their own and is mostly stolen. Everything that they call ideas, convictions, views, conceptions of the world has all been pilfered from various sources, and all of it together makes up personality and must be cast aside. But you yourself said that work begins with personality, said someone there. Quite true, replied G. Therefore we must first of all establish of what precisely we are speaking. Of what moment in man's development, and of what level of being? Just now I was simply speaking of a man in life who has had no connection whatever with the work. Excuse me. Such a man, particularly if he belongs to the intellectual classes, is almost entirely composed of personality. In most cases his essence ceases to develop at a very early age. I know respected fathers of families, professors, full of various ideas, well-known authors, important officials who were almost ministers, whose essence had stopped developing approximately at the age of 12, and that is not so bad. It sometimes happens that certain aspects of essence stop at 5 or 6 years of age, and then everything ends. All the rest is not their own. It is repertoire, or taken from books, or it has been created by imitating ready-made models. After this there were many conversations in which G took part, during which we tried to find out the reason for our failure to fulfill the task set by G, but the more we talked, the less we understood what he actually wanted from us. This only shows to what extent you do not know yourselves, said G. I do not doubt that at least some of you sincerely wished to do what I said, that is, to relate the story of their lives. At the same time they see that they cannot do it, and do not even know how to begin. But remember that sooner or later you will have to go through this. This is, as it is called, one of the first tests on the way. Without going through this, no one can go further. What is it we do not understand? Asked someone. You do not understand what it means to be sincere, said G. You are so used to lying, both to yourselves and to others, that you can find neither words nor thoughts when you wish to speak the truth. To tell the complete truth about oneself is very difficult, but before telling it one must know it, and you do not even know what the truth about yourselves consists of. Some day I will tell every one of you his chief feature or chief fault. We shall then see whether you will understand me or not. Zanya asked a fixed date for chapter 13. No fixed date, but if you're keen, Zanya, maybe next week. Next week, Thursday. How about that? Perhaps we can fix a date now. Next week, Thursday. One very interesting conversation took place at this time. I felt very strongly everything that took place at that time. Especially strongly did I feel that in spite of every effort, I was unable to remember myself for any length of time. At first something seemed to be successful, but later it all went, and I felt without any doubt the deep sleep in which I was immersed. Failures in attempts to relate the story of my life, and especially the fact that I even failed to understand clearly what G wanted, still further increased my bad mood, which, however, as always with me, expressed itself not in depression, but in irritation. In this state I came once to lunch with G in a restaurant on the Sadovaya opposite the Gostinoi Dvor. I was probably very curt, or on the contrary very silent. "What is the matter with you today?" asked G. "I myself do not know," I said. "Only I am beginning to feel that with us nothing is being achieved, or rather, that I am achieving nothing. I cannot speak about others, but I cease to understand you, and you no longer explain anything as you used to explain it in the beginning, and I feel that in this way nothing will be achieved." "Wait a little," said G. "Soon conversations will start. Try to understand me. Up to now we have been trying to find each thing's place. Soon we shall begin to call things by their proper names." G's words remained in my memory, but I did not go into them, and continued my own thoughts. "What does it matter," I said, "how we shall call things when I can connect nothing together? You never answer any questions I ask." "Very well," said G, laughing. "I promise to answer now any question you care to ask, as it happens in fairy tales." I felt that he wanted to draw me out of my bad mood, and I was inwardly grateful to him, although something in me refused to be mollified. And suddenly I remembered that I wanted above all to know what G thought about eternal recurrence, about the repetition of lives as I understood it. I had many times tried to start a conversation about this and to tell G my views, but these conversations had always remained almost monologues. G had listened in silence and then begun to talk of something else. "Very well," I said. "Tell me what you think of recurrence. Is there any truth in this, or none at all? What I mean is, do we live only this once and then disappear, or does everything repeat and repeat itself, perhaps an endless number of times, only we do not know and do not remember?" "This idea of repetition," said G, "is not the full and absolute truth, but it is the nearest possible approximation of the truth. In this case, truth cannot be expressed in words, but what you say is very near to it, and if you understand why I do not speak of this, you will be still nearer to it. What is the use of a man knowing about recurrence if he is not conscious of it, and if he himself does not change? One can say even that if a man does not change, repetition does not exist for him. If you tell him about repetition, it will only increase his sleep. Why should he make any efforts today when there is so much time and so many possibilities ahead, the whole of eternity? Why should he bother today? This is exactly why the system does not say anything about repetition and takes only this one life, which we know. The system has neither meaning nor sense without striving for self-change, and work on self-change must begin today, immediately. All laws can be seen in one life. Knowledge about the repetition of lives will add nothing for a man if he does not see how everything repeats itself in one life, that is, in this life, and if he does not strive to change himself in order to escape this repetition, but if he changes something essential in himself, that is, if he attains something, this cannot be lost. And I'll just read a sentence there. If we go up a few lines, I'm just going to repeat it because it's very powerful for anyone who is engaged in this work and wants to work on themselves. It says, "The system has neither meaning nor sense without striving for self-change, and work on self-change must begin today, immediately." And so take that to heart. Gurdjieff says, we only have today. Tomorrow is a disease which humanity suffers from in Beelzebub's tales. And he says these humans of the planet Earth, they suffer from this disease called tomorrow. And it's a popular thing in Spain and Spanish culture. Mañana, do it tomorrow. But the only time for work is right now in this present moment. Is the conclusion right that all the tendencies that are created or formed must grow, I asked. "Yes and no," said G. "This is true in most cases, just as it is true in one life. But on a big scale, new forces may enter. I shall not explain this now, but think about what I am going to say. Planetary influences also can change. They are not permanent. Besides this, tendencies themselves can be different. There are tendencies which, once they have appeared, continue and develop by themselves mechanically, and there are others which need constant pushing and which immediately weaken and may vanish altogether or turn into dreaming if a man ceases to work on them. Moreover, there is a definite time, a definite term for everything. Possibilities for everything, he emphasized these words, exist only for a definite time. I was extremely interested in everything G said. Much of this I had guessed before. But the fact that he recognized my fundamental premises and all that he brought into them had for me a tremendous importance. Everything began immediately to become connected. I felt that I saw the outline of the majestic building which was spoken of in the glimpses of truth. My bad mood vanished. I did not even notice when. G sat there smiling. You see how easy it is to turn you? But perhaps I was merely romancing to you. Perhaps there is no recurrence at all. What pleasure is it when a sulky Ouspensky sits there, does not eat, does not drink? Let us try to cheer him up, I think to myself. And how is one to cheer a person up? One likes funny stories, for another you must find his hobby. And I know that Ouspensky has this hobby, eternal recurrence. So I offered to answer any question of his. I knew what he would ask. But G's chaff did not affect me. He had given me something very substantial and could not take it back. I did not believe his jokes and did not believe that he could have invented what he had said about recurrence. I also learned to understand his intonations. The future showed that I was right, for although G did not introduce the idea of recurrence into his exposition of the system, he referred several times to the idea of recurrence, chiefly in speaking of the lost possibilities of people who had approached the system and then had drawn away from it. Hello, Georgia. Nice to see you. Welcome. And so this is another, there's sort of, for me, I've mentioned, I think, in one of the other readings, I probably said it a lot and often, and I'm saying it again now, but that sort of just that last little paragraph there that we just read, you could almost see it as a throwaway paragraph. You could see it as sort of, but for me, you can really go deeply into these paragraphs and chapters and, ponder these things and make connections to other sections where they speak about the same thing. But one important just bit there at the end, the last sentence, he says there, chiefly in speaking of the lost possibilities of people who had approached the system and then had drawn away from it. And so this often happens, that people who find the system, who work on themselves for some years, but then for whatever reason, a job or a relationship or a sort of life disaster, go away from the work and are not actively involved anymore, but, life swarms over them or swamps them like a massive wave and they're away. What happens is sort of the soul will yearn for the work, for the ideas, for the self-remembering, for the awareness, for the consciousness, but the ego and personality will sort of try and keep it away. And a lot of people's lives I've heard of have sort of come to ruin by, again, sitting between two stools, not in the work and not really in life, but sort of hovering between them. And I'm sort of not saying that to scare people away from the ideas, but once you realize how powerful the ideas are, how important they can be to one's life, you should really hold them with an air of, sanctity, I suppose, or sacredness. Anyway, conversations in groups continued as usual. Once G said that he wanted to carry out an experiment on the separate... Oh yeah, here we go. This is what I was talking about. This is a very interesting section. So, yeah. Excuse me. Conversation in groups continued as usual. Once G said that he wanted to carry out an experiment on the separation of personality from essence. We were all very interested because he had promised experiments for a long time, but till then we had seen nothing. I will not describe his methods, I will merely describe the people whom he chose that first evening for the experiment. One was no longer young and was a man who occupied a fairly prominent position in society. At our meetings he spoke much and often about himself, his family, about Christianity, and about the events of the moment connected with the war and with all possible kinds of scandal that had very much disgusted him. The other was younger. Many of us did not consider him to be a serious person. Very often he played what is called the fool, or, on the other hand, entered into endless formal arguments about some or other details of the system without any relation whatever to the whole. It was very difficult to understand him. He spoke in a confused and intricate manner, even of the most simple things, mixing up in a most impossible way different points of view and words belonging to different categories and levels. I pass over the beginning of the experiment. We were sitting in the big drawing room. The conversation went on as usual. "Now observe," G whispered to us. The older of the two, who was speaking heatedly about something, suddenly became silent in the middle of a sentence and seemed to sink in his chair, looking straight in front of him. At a sign from G, we continued to talk without looking at him. The younger one began to listen to the talk, and then he spoke himself. All of us looked at one another. His voice had become different. He told us some observations about himself in a clear, simple, and intelligible manner, without superfluous words, without extravagances, and without buffoonery. Buffoonery. Then he became silent. He smoked a cigarette and was obviously thinking of something. The first one sat still without moving, as though sunken into a ball. "Ask him what he is thinking about," said G quietly. "I?" He lifted his head as though waking up when he was questioned. "About nothing." He smiled weakly, as though apologizing, or as though he were surprised at anyone asking him what he was thinking about. "Well, you were talking about the war just now," said one of us, "about what would happen if we made peace with the Germans. Do you still think as you did then?" "I don't know, really," he said in an uncertain voice. "Did I say that?" "Yes, certainly. You just said that everyone was obliged to think about it, that no one had the right not to think about it, and that no one had the right to forget the war. Everyone ought to have a definite opinion, yes or no, for or against the war." He listened as though he did not grasp what the questioner was saying. "Yes," he said. "How odd. I do not remember anything about it. But aren't you interested in it?" "No, it does not interest me at all." "Are you not thinking of the consequences of all that is now taking place, of the results for Russia, for the whole of civilization?" He shook his head as though with regret. "I do not understand what you are talking about," he said. "It does not interest me at all, and I know nothing about it." "Well, then, you spoke before of your family. Would it not be very much easier for you if they became interested in our ideas and joined the work?" "Yes, perhaps," again in an uncertain voice. "But why should I think about it?" "Well, you said you were afraid of the gulf, as you expressed it, which was growing between you and them." No reply. "But what do you think about it now?" "I'm not thinking about it at all." "If you were asked what you would like, what would you say?" Again a wondering glance. "I do not want anything." "But think about it. But think, what would you like?" And this is hilarious. I remember it well. On the small table beside him there stood an unfinished glass of tea. He gazed at it for a long time, as though considering something. He glanced around him twice, then again looked at the glass, and said in such a serious voice and with such serious intonations that we all looked at one another, "I think I should like some raspberry jam." "Why are you questioning him?" said a voice from the corner which we hardly recognized. This was the second experiment. "Can you not see he is asleep?" "And you yourself?" asked one of us. "I, on the contrary, have woken up." "Why has he gone to sleep while you have woken up?" "I do not know." With this, the experiment ended. Neither of them remembered anything the next day. G explained to us that with the first man, everything that constituted the subject of his ordinary conversation, of his alarms and agitations, was in personality, and when his personality was asleep, practically nothing remained. In the personality of the other, there was also a great deal of undue talkativeness, but behind the personality there was an essence which knew as much as the personality and knew it better, and when personality went to sleep, essence took its place, to which it had a much greater right. "Note that contrary to his custom he spoke very little," said G, "but he was observing all of you and everything that was taking place, and nothing escaped him." But of what use is it to him if he also does not remember?" said one of us. Essence remembers, said G. Personality has forgotten. And this was necessary because otherwise personality would have perverted everything and would have ascribed all this to itself. But this is a kind of black magic, said one of us. Worse, said G. Wait, and you will see worse than that. When speaking of types, G once said, have you noticed what a tremendous part type plays in the relationship between man and woman? I have noticed, I said, that throughout his whole life every man comes into contact with women of a definite type and every woman comes into contact with men of a definite type, as though the type of woman for every man had been predetermined and the type of man predetermined for every woman. There is a good deal of truth in that, said G, but in that form it is, of course, much too general. Actually, you did not see types of men and women, but types of events. What I speak of refers to the real type, that is to say, to essence. If people were to live in essence, one type would always find the other type, and wrong types would never come together. But people live in personality. Personality has its own interests and its own tastes which have nothing in common with the interests and the tastes of essence. Personality, in our case, is the result of the wrong work of centers. For this reason, personality can dislike precisely what essence like and like what essence does not like. Here is where the struggle between essence and personality begins. Essence knows what it wants but cannot explain it. Personality does not want to hear of it and takes no account of it. It has its own desires, and it acts in its own way, but its power does not continue beyond that moment, and after that, in some way or other, the two essences have to live together, and they hate one another. No sort of acting can help here. In one way or another, essence or type gains the upper hand and decides. In this case, nothing can be done by reason or by calculation. Neither can so-called love help because, in the real meaning of the word, mechanical man cannot love. With him, it loves or it does not love. At the same time, sex plays a tremendous role in maintaining the mechanicalness of life. Everything that people do is connected with sex. Politics, religion, art, the theatre, music is all sex. Do you think people go to the theatre or to church to pray or to see some new play? That is only for the sake of appearances. The principal thing in the theatre as well as in church is that there will be a lot of women or a lot of men. This is the centre of gravity of all gatherings. What do you think brings people to cafes, to restaurants, to various fetes? Only one thing: sex. It is the principal motive force of all mechanicalness, all sleep, all hypnosis depends upon it. You must try to understand what I mean. Mechanicalness is especially dangerous when people try to explain it by something else and not by what it really is. When sex is clearly conscious of itself and does not cover itself up by anything else, it is not the mechanicalness about which I am speaking. On the contrary, sex which exists by itself and is not dependent on anything else is already a great achievement. But the evil lies in this constant self-deception. What then is the deduction? Should it be or should it be so or should it be changed? Asked someone. G smiled. That is something people always ask, he said. Whatever they may be speaking about, they ask, ought it to be like this? Ought it to be like that? And how can it be changed? That is, what ought to be done in such a case? As though it were possible to change anything, as though it were possible to do anything. You at least ought to have realized by now how naive such questions are. Cosmic forces have created this state of affairs, and cosmic forces control this state of affairs. And you ask, can it be left like that, or should it be changed? God himself could change nothing. Do you remember what was said about the 48 laws? They cannot be changed, but liberation from a considerable portion of them is possible. That is to say, there is a possibility of changing the state of affairs for oneself. It is possible to escape from the general law. You should understand that in this case, as well as in all others, the general law cannot be changed, but one can change one's own position in relation to this law. One can escape from the general law. The more so since in this law about which I speak, that is, in the power of sex over people, are included many different possibilities. It includes the chief form of slavery, and it is also the chief possibility of liberation. This is what you must understand. New birth, of which we have spoken before, depends as much upon sex energy as do physical birth and the propagation of the species. Hydrogen C12 is the hydrogen which represents the final product of the transformation of food in the human organism. This is the matter with which sex works and which sex manufactures. It is seed or fruit. Hydrogen C12 can pass into dough of the next octave with the help of an additional shock. But this shock can be of a dual nature, and different octaves can begin, one outside the organism which has produced C, and the other in the organism itself. The union of male and female, C12, and all that accompanies it, constitutes the shock of the first kind, and the new octave, begun with its help, develops independently as a new organism or a new life. This is the normal and natural way to use the energy of C12. But in the same organism there is a further possibility, and this is the possibility of creating a new life within the actual organism, in which the C12 has been manufactured, without the union of the two principles, the male and the female. A new octave then develops within the organism, not outside it. This is the birth of the astral body. You must understand that the astral body is born of the same material, of the same matter, as the physical body, only the process is different. The whole of the physical body, all its cells are, so to speak, permeated by emanations of the matter C12, and when they have become sufficiently saturated, the matter C12 begins to crystallize. The crystallization of this matter constitutes the formation of the astral body. The transition of matter C12 into emanations and the gradual saturation of the whole organism is by it is what alchemy calls transmutation or transformation. It is first this transformation of the physical body into the astral that alchemy called the transformation of the coarse into the fine, or the transformation of base metals into gold. Completed transmutation, that is to say, the formation of the astral body, is possible only in a healthy, normally functioning organism. In a sick or a perverted or a crippled organism, no transmutation is possible. Is complete sexual abstinence necessary for transmutation, and is sexual abstinence in general useful for work on oneself? We asked him. Here there is not one, but a number of questions, said G. In the first place, sexual abstinence is necessary for transmutation only in certain cases, that is, for certain types of people. For others it is not at all necessary, and with yet others it comes by itself when transmutation begins. I will explain this more clearly. For certain types, a long and complete sexual abstinence is necessary for transmutation to begin. This means, in other words, that without a long and complete sexual abstinence, transmutation will not begin. But once it has begun, abstinence is no longer necessary. In other cases, that is, with other types, transmutation can begin in a normal sexual life, and on the contrary can begin sooner and proceed better, with a very great outward expenditure of sex energy. In the third case, the beginning of transmutation does not require abstinence, but, having begun, transmutation takes the whole of the sexual energy and puts an end to normal sexual life, or the outward expenditure of sex energy. Then, the other question, is sexual abstinence useful for work or not? It is useful if there is abstinence in all centres. If there is abstinence in one centre and full liberty of imagination in the others, then there could be nothing worse. And still more, abstinence can be useful if a man knows what to do with the energy which he saves in this way. If he does not know what to do with it, nothing whatever can be gained by abstinence. Speaking in general, what is the most correct form of life in this connection from the point of view of the work? It is impossible to say. I repeat that while a man does not know, it is better for him not to attempt anything. Until he has new and exact knowledge, it will be quite enough if his life is guided by the usual rules and principles. If a man begins to theorize and invent in this sphere, it will lead to nothing except psychopathy. But it must again be remembered that only a person who is completely normal as regards sex has any chance in the work. Any kind of originality, strange tastes, strange desires, or on the other hand fears, constantly working buffers, must be destroyed from the very beginning. Modern education and modern life create an enormous number of sexual psychopaths. They have no chance at all in the work. Speaking in general, there are only two correct ways of expending sexual energy: normal sexual life and transmutation. All inventions in this sphere are very dangerous. People have tried abstinence from times beyond memory. Sometimes, very rarely, it has led to something, but in most cases what is called abstinence is simply exchanging normal sensations for abnormal, because the abnormal are more easily hidden. But it is not about this that I wish to speak. You must understand where lies the chief evil and what makes for slavery. It is not in sex itself, but in the abuse of sex. But what the abuse of sex means is again misunderstood. People usually take this to be either excess or perversion. But these are comparatively innocent forms of abuse of sex. And it is necessary to know the human machine very well in order to grasp what abuse of sex in the real meaning of these words is. It means the wrong work of centers in relation to sex. That is, the action of the sex center through other centers, and the action of the other centers through the sex center. Or, to be still more precise, the functioning of the sex center with energy borrowed from other centers, and the functioning of other centers with energy borrowed from the sex center. Can sex be regarded as an independent center? Asked one of those present. It can, said G. At the same time, if all the lower story is taken as one whole, then sex can be regarded as the neutralizing part of the moving center. With what hydrogen does the sex center work? Asked another. This question had interested us for a long time, but we had not previously been able to answer it, and G, when he had been asked before, had never given a direct reply. The sex center works with hydrogen 12, he said on this occasion. That is to say, it ought to work with it. This is C12. But the fact that it very rarely works with its proper hydrogen. Abnormalities in the working of the sex center require special study. In the first place, it must be noted that normally in the sex center, as well as in the higher emotional and the higher thinking centers, there is no negative side. In all the other centers, except the higher ones, in the thinking, in the emotional, in the moving, in the instinctive, in all of them there are, so to speak, two halves, the positive and the negative. Affirmation and negation, or yes and no in the thinking center, pleasant and unpleasant sensations in the moving and instinctive center. There is no such division in the sex center. There are no positive and negative sides in it. There are no unpleasant sensations or unpleasant feelings in it. There is either a pleasant sensation, a pleasant feeling, or there is nothing, an absence of any sensation, complete indifference. But in consequence of the wrong work of centers, it often happens that the sex center unites with the negative part of the emotional center, or with the negative part of the instinctive center, and then stimulation of a certain kind of the sex center, or even any stimulation at all of the sex center, calls forth unpleasant feelings and unpleasant sensations, and unpleasant sensations. People who experience unpleasant feelings and sensations which have been evoked in them through the ideas and imagination connected with sex are inclined to regard them as a great virtue and something original. In actual fact, it is simply disease. Everything connected with sex should be either pleasant or indifferent. Unpleasant feelings and sensations all come from the emotional center or the instinctive center. This is the abuse of sex. It is necessary further to remember that the sex center works with hydrogen 12. This means that it is stronger and quicker than all other centers. Sex, in fact, governs all other centers. The only thing in ordinary circumstances, that is, when man has neither consciousness nor will, that holds the sex center in submission, is buffers. Buffers can entirely bring it to naught. That is, they can stop its normal manifestation, but they cannot destroy its energy. The energy remains and passes over to other centers, finding expression for itself through them. In other words, the other centers rob the sex center of the energy which it does not use itself. The energy of the sex center in the work of the thinking, emotional, and moving centers can be recognized by a particular taste, by a particular fervor, by vehemence, which the nature of the affair concerned does not call for. The thinking center writes books, but in making use of the energy of the sex center, it does not simply occupy itself with philosophy, science, or politics. It is always fighting something, disputing, criticizing, creating new subjective theories. The emotional center preaches Christianity, abstinence, asceticism, or the fear and horror of sin, hell, the torment of sinners, eternal fire, all this with the energy of the sex center. Or on the other hand, it works up revolutions, robs, burns, kills, again with the same energy. The moving center occupies itself with sport, creates various records, climbs mountains, jumps fences, wrestles, fights, and so on. In all these instances, that is, in the work of the thinking center as well as in the work of the emotional and the moving centers, when they work with the energy of the sex center, there is always one general characteristic, and this is a certain particular vehemence, and, together with it, the uselessness of the work in question. Neither the thinking, nor the emotional, nor the moving centers can ever create anything useful with the energy of the sex center. This is an example of the abuse of sex. But this is only one aspect of it. Another aspect consists in the fact that when the energy of the sex center is plundered by the other centers and spent on useless work, it has nothing left for itself and has to steal the energy of other centers which is much lower and coarser than its own. And yet the sex center is very important for the general activity and particularly the inner growth of the organism, because working with hydrogen-12, it can receive a very fine food of impressions, such as none of the ordinary centers can receive. The fine food of impressions is very important for the manufacture of the higher hydrogens. But when the sex center works with energy that is not its own, that is, with the comparatively low hydrogens 48 or 24, its impressions become much coarser, and it ceases to play the role in the organism which it could play. At the same time, union with and the use of its energy by the thinking center creates far too great an imagination on the subject of sex, and in addition a tendency to be satisfied with this imagination. Union with the emotional center creates sentimentality or, on the contrary, jealousy, cruelty. This is again a picture of the abuse of sex. What must be done to struggle against the abuse of sex? Asked somebody present. G laughed. I was just waiting for that question, he said, but you already ought to understand that it is just as impossible to explain to a man who has not yet begun to work on himself and does not know the structure of the machine what the abuse of sex means, as it is to say what must be done to avoid these abuses. Right work on oneself begins with the creation of a permanent center of gravity. When a permanent center of gravity has been created, everything else begins to be disposed and distributed in subordination to it. The question comes from this: from what and how can a permanent center of gravity be created? And to this may be replied that only a man's attitude to the work, to school, his valuation of the work, and his realization of the mechanicalness and aimlessness of everything else can create in him a permanent center of gravity. Again, another very important paragraph there. I don't know why I'm touching my screen, but very important about the center of gravity and how one can bring that about. The role of the sex center in creating a general equilibrium and a permanent center of gravity can be very, very big, or just one very, very big. According to its energy, that is to say, if it uses its own energy, the sex center stands on a level with the higher emotional center, and all the other centers are subordinate to it. Therefore, it would be a great thing if it worked with its own energy. This alone would indicate a comparatively high level of being. And in this case, that is, if the sex center worked with its own energy and in its own place, all other centers could work correctly in their places and with their own energies. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 12. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I must say how pleased I am to see so many of you here listening. 10 at the moment, 10 concurrent viewers, which is surprising for a chapter of In Search of the Miraculous. And I couldn't be happier because, I mean, yeah, maybe many of you may have fallen asleep, literally, dreamland listening. But if you're new and this is the first chapter you've listened to, I recommend go back and begin with chapter 1, and work back up to chapter 12 or chapter 13. We'll be reading next Thursday. Zanyar, as I said, hopefully, inshallah, we can bring that about. Hey, you're welcome, Julius. My pleasure. I'm glad glad to see you here and that you are enjoying In Search of the Miraculous. And just again, I emphasize this often, and I'm gonna emphasize it again. The centers, that particular part at the end, was about the sex center, but there's also chapters previously on the centers more generally. The intellectual, the emotional, the moving and the instinctive, and so you can read all about them. And it was very interesting for me to read about this sex center again this time, and how it sort of how it sort of colors and taints the other centers, and sort of rouse them up, makes them more energized, I suppose, or more outward facing, more externalized, because like he says, everything is sex, and that's a bit of a general statement. I'm not sure how true that is, but if you look at things on a sort of biological and evolutionary level, Yeah, and again, Kathy has just mentioned have to check out what is hydrogen 12, and again, that's in one of the other chapters. There's several chapters that speak of hydrogens, and early on in the book, you just get a little taste of what a hydrogen is, and then later on, you get the full gamut of how the hydrogens work and are active in the different centers, and then also how external shocks, the shock of self-remembering and the shock of not expressing negative emotions, will transmute these particular hydrogens into finer hydrogens in which the higher centers can work with them. So, I mean, if you're new, none of this will make any sense. If you've read all the chapters and are aware of the work, it might make a bit more sense, and it might cause you, like what Kathy here is saying, to go back and check out what hydrogen 12 is, to go back further, to read again about the centers, to read about the centers and the hydrogens, and just, wherever your imagination takes you, you must go, read, and develop yourself. And so, as there's no questions, which is fine. Like I say, I'll just say again, any questions at any point on any chapter, you are free to ask. Obviously, this is YouTube, but there is a commentary playlist. There is a In Search of the Miraculous commentary playlist. I think there's as many as 22 videos in there now. I apologize, I haven't been very active, but I mean, I'm waiting for questions, and then I'll do it. And yes, hello Nikos. Good night, Julie, and goodbye, No Strings. Nice to see you. And Kathy, just quickly, Kathy has made a comment, not a question. Kathy says also that there is no negative side to the sex energy or the sex center. And it is very interesting because Gurdjieff has said there earlier, the intellectual center is, I think, like, dislike, or yes or no. In the emotional center, it's like, here, let's go back. I think it's right here. Let me try and find it for you, Kathy. It's, I need to make it a bit bigger. Bear with me. I'm just going to find this because it says, Yeah, here we go. Is this it at the top? No, I'm not going to be able to find it. But anyways, talking briefly about sort of the positive, negative, yes, no, pleasant, unpleasant, pleasure, pain. And with the sex center, it's either active or inactive. So you're either, there's sort of no negative sexual energy unless there is, and like what he says there, unless what word does he use? Like I can't remember the word, but sort of there is a negative sort of attitude and approach to sex that can make it, I don't know if negative's the right word, but deprived maybe is a better word, like in the Christian sense, that it's sinful. If one would have these thoughts, then that will sort of bring in an impression to the whole being and will impact the sex act, and then everything that follows in the days preceding that. But yeah, very interesting point, and just another very interesting chapter. And as Zanya was very keen for chapter 13, of course, that's caused me to put it in the diary. Hopefully next week, Thursday, we'll read chapter 13, and then we're approaching the end. And I think we're going to decide again, and I've mentioned it before in the Discord group, but I think we're going to read Jin de Salzman's The Reality of Being next. And then after that, Meetings with Remarkable Men, I think. So, yeah. So, yeah, guys, again, I'm so happy to see you all. Thanks all for joining me. This was wonderful. And, yeah, put it in your diary, and I hope you can make next week for chapter 13. But for now, guys, take care. And, keep remembering yourselves. Observe yourselves and others and the universe. And hopefully we'll all be enlightened by next Thursday. Take care, guys. See you.